So good morning again. My name is Stan Tekiela, and who needs an introduction? Who needs to hear the introduction? Nobody. Let's get right into it. I don't know if this is good or if this is bad. I don't know what that is. My reputation precedes me. Nice.
That might be scary.
Yeah, that is frightening. It really is. Just to humor me, let me tell you a little bit about myself anyhow. So I'm a naturalist and a wildlife photographer. It was 31 years ago that I got hooked up with Adventure Publications out of Cambridge, Minnesota, and got to realize my lifelong dream of writing a nature book. And I finished that first book, and nobody said stop. And so I got going, and here we are 30 years later, and I'm at 195 titles, and I'm standing in front of you guys. So it's been a lot of fun. I have a syndicated radio show that I do across a bunch of different stations. I have a syndicated newspaper column that I write. You can find a lot of that on my website, things like that. So, and I'm a wildlife photographer. I hope you've been enjoying some of the photos as we go with. And today we're going to talk about a new book, bird migration, and it's a topic that I find immensely interesting, but it is so complex and so convoluted, and there are no steadfast rules in it. That if you come away from this talk with a general sense, kind of a feeling of migration, it'll be a success. Because it is really an interesting topic that is quite in-depth, and I absolutely love this whole migration thing. It is sort of something. Like my flying squirrels here? Yeah. That's my front yard, by the way. Oh, wow. I just love these guys. They're a riot. All right. Questions before we get started? No questions before we get started? Okay. Let's get going. Let's talk about the migration. All right, so the mystery of migration. That's a good name for it too, because there's a lot of mystery still in migration here. So nature's full, of course, a lot of wonderment, mystery, and migration is one of those things that it's so obvious to us. We see it all the time, but we don't give it a second thought, and we don't look into it with enough depth to go, holy mackerel, how does that actually happen? And so hopefully today we'll do that. So it seems simple. It seems like, oh, well, they just migrate. We just say that. Well, they migrate, whatever. If it was only so simple, it'd be a whole lot easier for everybody. So, most everything in nature is tied to the driving forces, the need to feed and the need to breed. And that's what I always say. This is why I like being a naturalist, because it's all about two things, food and sex. This is the things I understand. So, it works out really well for me, So, and migration is nature's way for a bird to take advantage of many new opportunities for both finding food and finding a new partner. And that helps to mix up our genetics. So it works out pretty darn well. By the way, these are all my own photos too. A few mallards here too. So some theories to help explain migration phenomenon here. So avian migration evolved over millions of years. Now when you think about migration, it's easy to think about it in terms of today. But when you think about it, as far back as our last glaciation, which was 10,000 years ago, the birds had to adapt to that, because the northern tier states were covered in a mile thick of ice, and they're clearly not migrating there, were they? So the birds really had to adapt to those changes and all the climate changes that we've had over the thousands of years. So the birds are really adapting very quickly to these types of things. Migration allows birds to expand their range into areas that they normally weren't, and to find abundant food source. Everybody always asks the same question all the time. How did migration start? Just how old do you think I am? How did it start? Who knows? It just went on. And it's nature. You can sum it up very easily by saying it's nature exploring new options all the time. And those options that lead to dead ends don't work, but the options that lead to other things such as migration really do very well. So, gains suitable breeding habitats with less competition is another good theory as to why migration all started, and the offspring of these pioneers in migration most likely continued on with this habit of migrating. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, but if the cost of migrating outweighed the benefits, it would not last. So clearly, the benefits outweighed the cost of it. So, and there it is. If the cost of migration were more than the benefits, migration would not have come about. So at least 4,000 species of birds migrate today. That's 40% of all our bird species. So that again, that's a number that shows you that this must be a very beneficial type of thing, because look at how many species are actually doing it. In North America, about 350 species migrate. So when you live in places like I live, Minnesota, it just takes one winter for you to understand why you would migrate. So wintering grounds and non-wintering grounds, and then the spring and summer grounds, all are very, very different. So too often migration is thought as one kind of movement from north to south, south to north, back and forth. A simple, moving up in the springtime, turning around in the fall, and moving back down. This is what people think of as migration, and that's it. Well, in fact, there's many different types of migrations that we're going to learn here. So the truth is, there's many types. So there's the classic, what we're thinking of migration is called a complete migration. So, i.e., Oriole, shows up about whatever time, April, May, or depending on what part of the country you're in, spends its summer, turns around and goes back. This is your classic complete migrator. A migrator that is, you can count on them. They're very predictable. And we see that all the time. But there's also partial migrators. So for example, like bluebirds and robins, which I find absolutely hysterical, because robin, the genus and species name for robin, Turdus migratoris, is like the stereotypical classic migrating bird, but in fact they really don't migrate very far, a couple hundred miles, just far enough to get out of the cold and the snow in order to survive and then come back up. And in fact, in places like where I'm at, I'd say 10% of the population doesn't even migrate. So, but 10% of the orioles don't hang around. So really, early understanding of migration, especially when they were naming these birds, was lacking, to say the least. So, eruptive migration. Eruptive migration is completely different from our complete and our partial migration, and it only happens every 5 to 10 years. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. And then, of course, there's birds that don't migrate at all. And then some birds, like i.e. goldfinches, you really can't even use the word migration in their movement. They're nomadic. They move around. They're just like, sometimes they're up north in the wintertime, and sometimes they're down south in the summer, and they're just all over the place. And they're following local food sources. So we've got all these different types of migration. So already you should be going, oh boy, this migration is a bit more complicated than I thought, because it really does show some vast differences in them. So perhaps the most well-known type of migration, when people think about this, are warblers and tanagers. These are neotropical migrants. These are birds that go all the way down to the tropics in the wintertime and then come back up. By the way, if you ever go down to the tropics, they call them their birds. And then when they're here, then we call them our birds. Which is interesting too. And a lot of people don't understand in this migration things, when you talk about these neotropical migrants like your warblers and your tanagers, they come up to the northern states and they breed. And then when they turn around, they go back down south in the wintertime, they're not breeding. I think that's a common misconception amongst a lot of people, thinking that, oh, well, they go up north, they breed, they come back down, they breed. No. They come up, they breed, they go back down, they rest for the wintertime. Then they go back up again and try again next year. Which should really kind of cue off a signal in your head that says, man, depending on where you're at, and I know you're from all over the country here, depending on where you're at and depending on what state you're at, your backyards are critical habitat for a lot of these types of birds, like tanagers and warblers, because that's where they go to breed. If you don't have good habitat, they're not going to reproduce down south. They're depending on your area for that good habitat. It's really important. And then we have things like rough-legged hawks that don't fly down to the tropics. They start out in the Arctic and they move down to places like Minnesota in the wintertime. Now, there's something wrong with you when you come to Minnesota for winter. Yeah, Yeah, so here's a good example of it. So here's the Arctic Circle. The green area is where they're at in the summertime, and here's down here in the wintertime. They kind of literally come down down into areas where there's a lot of winter for the winter. But when you live up in the Arctic, it's obvious why you want to leave. This is, well, what do you think? Is this complete migration? Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. Yeah, I mean, we're not going to the tropics or anything, but it's certainly still a complete migration too. Roles of large lakes play a role in a lot of migration. Common loons. Now, again, where I'm from in Minnesota, we have lots of loons here. It's interesting, they'll leave Minnesota and then go east to the Great Lakes, and then spend all their time in the Great Lakes before they head south. So it's not when we think about migration, we think of north-south. And again, that's overly simplistic, and it's not true, because a lot of times it's not. And 2 weeks ago, I was leading a birding trip up to Hawk Ridge in Duluth, and where we were capturing hawks, banding them, and releasing them for long-term, population studies. And my good friend Frank Taylor always takes out his globe, and he likes to show this on a globe. He'll hold up the globe, and he'll show where's Alaska. So if you've got a bird in Alaska, when it goes to leave and goes, go for the winter time, which direction does it go? Everybody says, oh, they go south. But if you look on the globe, south is the ocean. It doesn't work. They got to go east, and they cut across Canada, and down into the United States. So north-south is just a generalization that actually doesn't accurately depict exactly what these birds are doing. So there's a lot to it. And things like this with the loons, they do great studies with these loons. They'll come out of Minnesota, go to Lake Michigan, and then they'll spend a month or more swimming down Lake Michigan, down to the bottom. And they're just fishing as they go along. And when they get, you can just imagine when they get down to the bottom of Lake Michigan, what do they hit? Gary, Indiana. You can just imagine these birds going, oh, jeez. They're gonna fly, yeah. Get the hell out of here. A lot of things that we're, so we're damming up a lot of these rivers, or have, in kind of Kentucky and Tennessee area. Those big reservoirs are now homes to wintering loons, which is relatively new. So they're not even going all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico or down into the Atlantic on that side too. Oh, there you go. It shows you the routes in which these birds go. And some of the ones, when we have a few loons in Michigan and things, they're going to go straight east. Loons, by the way, they're up in New Hampshire and Vermont and things like that, go straight east and hit the ocean. And then they'll spend their whole time in the ocean through the winter time. So migration is not as easy as you think it is, right? So we have things like here, like the varied thrush here, leaves the Pacific Northwest and migrates eastward and overwinters in the upper Midwest. What a crazy bird! Why would you do that? You're going to leave Oregon and Washington, you're going to end up in Iowa. Something's wrong with you. You end up in Iowa in the wintertime. As far as I'm concerned. And then we got other types of migrations like the Dusky Grouse, this one here, which doesn't really migrate in the classic sense, but it goes up and down in elevation due to the change of seasons. So we're seeing birds that go up in the springtime, come down in the fall. So there's lots of different types of migration. So you got to be careful when you're talking to your customers about migration too. You got to define what kind of migration are we talking about. So, and then we have short distance migrators like the bluebirds. Here they are, the eastern bluebirds, up in the upper kind of eastern states, and they'll go down to the southern half of the state. So they're not really going all that far. If you're a bird who's already in southern Illinois, you're not going to go very far to just get out of the wintertime to spend the winter. So robins are another good example of this too, as partial migrators. Waiting, and they oftentimes will wait until they get pushed out by weather before they leave that too. Because this is very common to see robins in wintertime. But I can't tell you how many times I get new people who say, you probably have heard this a million times in your stores too, where it's like, oh my gosh, I have a robin. And it's like, well,
Spring is coming.
yeah, spring is coming. Well, they never left. And then we got raptors who migrate only as far south as they need, just like robins. And not all the red tails move too. A lot of the red tails hang around, even in tough areas where I live. You've got, birds. think of it as this way. Think of it as Mother Nature exploring new possibilities by hanging on for the wintertime. And then you have to think about these other things too. When you're talking about things like red-tailed hawks, in the wintertime, they're oftentimes are holding out, and what are they making a living on? Roadkill. So a lot of depends on the population and how much traffic there is and how much roadkill it takes, because that'll get them through the wintertime also. So then we have all sorts of crazy other migration things, like the house finch. I'm sure you know the story about the house finch here. Originally a bird of the America Southwest, and here we go. And interesting, what happened is this bird was trapped, brought to the East Coast, and sold as a caged bird. The males are bright red, they sing a pretty song, and so they were brought to the East Coast. They were sold into general population, and then when laws were passed to that outlawed that, these birds were released. Of course, they didn't just drop over dead when they were released. What happened? They found each other, started to breed, and what did they do? They started to migrate, and they started moving westward again, too, which is interesting. Within a span of just over a century, the movement of the house finches show how quickly the migration. Let's see if I have a map of it. Nope, I don't. So what happened is they started out in New York City, and they made their way eastward. And again, I live in Minnesota, and by 1980, they made it to Minnesota. And they just backfilled all across the entire country. So this is an interesting bird. This is a bird who didn't originally migrate, right? People intervened, kind of disrupted nature, if you will, moved it to a new location, let it go, and what happened? They adapted, and they migrated, and they started moving back, and now they've filled in everywhere. It's really kind of an interesting story. So if you live anywhere out in the Southwest, you can, and do you ever get this? I get this all the time. People realize, oh, non-native birds, non-native birds. Well, guess what? If you live here in Missouri, non-native bird,
Can't wait to say that.
I get a little kind of irritated with people, the whole non-native things, when in fact, house sparrows have been here longer than your families have been here. The history of your families have been here. So it's really interesting how all that works. Unpredictable migrators, we've got things like these eruptive migrators, like the Bohemian waxwing, the red-breasted nuthatches, and great gray owls. So no steadfast rules with these guys either. Every 5, 10, 12, whatever years comes around, you'll see a eruption, and that's with an I, eruption of these birds moving out of their traditional breeding area and into other areas where they normally aren't found. So, we've always thought, and snowy owls are another good example of that too. Snowy on there? No. And we always thought, well, because it's, what's the classic reason why these eruptive migrators happen? Food, and no food, the lack of food, right? And we've always thought that was the case, especially with snowy owls. Well, it turns out, in fact, it's just the opposite. On years where there are high lemming populations, the snowy owls reproduce like crazy. And there's an abundance of young snowy owls. And those are the years in which we see the snowy owls moving out of the North Country and coming down. And they've gone as far south as Florida. The snowies are very unusual, and they kind of disperse all over the place. So, in fact, it really isn't tied to a food shortage, but in fact, it was tied to a food abundance. So we have to kind of reset our set here. So, food shortages and food abundance. Yes, go ahead.
So those snowies that go down there, do they end up perishing?
So she wants to know about the snowies that do come south. Typically speaking, on average, 9 out of 10 of them are young males. Classic, right?
Go before,
We're out of here. Let's go explore the world, right? And they have about a 50% success rate. When they're moving into areas where they're not familiar with traffic or airplanes or whatever it may be, buildings, cell phone towers, wind turbines, I mean, it's just a myriad of obstacles for these birds. A lot of them don't survive, but a lot of them do. Get a chance, look up Project Snowstorm, and you can watch when they put transmitters on these birds, and you can track them yourself online, which is pretty neat. It shows like that. Yes?
When they go down to the Florida, do they go back to their original color? Or do they stay what?
Who are we talking about?
They snowy owls.
So the snowy owls start out this way. Young males are streaked a lot, and as they mature, age 3, 4, and 5, they become pure white. So you don't really see a lot of adult males going very far south. We see them up in Minnesota because it's kind of a regular range for them to come down to, but you don't see that. Typically you're seeing these young males which are really heavily barred. So mainly northern birds, snowy owls, great gray owls, Bohemian waxwings, pine siskins, of course, and red-breasted nuthatches are all classic eruptive migrators too. And they disperse in nearly all directions. That's the other thing we always think about too. We always think, well, they always go south. Well, check the Project Snowstorm website. In fact, some of them go north, some of them go east, some of them go west. They're going all over the place. So it's just not going south. When they're erupting, when they're moving out, they're going in all different types of directions too. So red crossbills are a good example of an eruptive species. Here they are, here's the range, year round, and then they move down into these areas on every 5 to 10 years. That's a very unusual thing. They just kind of show up. Nobody seems to really know why. Again, a lot of times it may be with the crossbills, it may be a shortage of pine seeds. So if it wasn't a good year for the conifers and they're not producing a lot of seeds in their cones, well then therefore we see some food shortage pressure on these things and they move. So again, it's not one set answer as to why. Some of it's food abundance, some of it's food shortages. So 800 snowy owls collected by museums reveal that was immature males that migrated the furthest south in the wintertime. So, and that's a good example of an immature male right there. Very heavily barred. Normally they would be, an adult male would be pure white almost. So, all right. Birds that stay put, non-migrators, your white-breasted nuthatches, your chickadees and things like that, they adapt to the seasonal changes. They grow more feathers, so on average, so let's just say your white-breasted nuthatch here has on average 1,200 feathers in the summertime. When they do their fall molt, molting is the process of dropping their old feathers and growing new feathers, they will add on extra feathers. So they can go from 1,200 feathers up to close to 2,000 feathers for the wintertime. Now you look at them and you don't go, oh my gosh, look at all those extra feathers. You don't see it. Typically, they're down feathers that are underneath the contour feathers that gives the shape to the bird. So it's like adding extra insulation, if you will. And so that helps them a lot. So growing more feathers. An extra layer of fat is important for winter. You can tell I live in Minnesota. We're getting ready for winter right now, in fact. And a lot of times these birds will huddle together to conserve heat and share heat. And then there's, to understand how these birds survive winter, it's a whole different process. So you and I, as mammals, we eat food, and through the digestion of our food, the motility, we create body heat, okay? Some of us a lot more than others, right, ladies? You know? And birds are very different. They don't produce heat in the same way. Birds produce heat in a way that they produce a fat, a specialized fat. That specialized fat is used to provide energy for the bird to shiver. So the bird is trembling all the time. And that's the muscle action of its, all of its muscles going together is how it produces its heat. So very different. And that's one thing that kind of, I love how people will oftentimes will try to relate their own human experience, their own human values, or their own human notions, and try to project it onto the birds. I mean, you're not even talking about the same kind of animal, you know, mammals versus, you know, the birds. It's so totally different. And so you're oftentimes, frankly, wrong when you make those assumptions. And so lots of things going on there. And then birds have the ability to go into torpor. Torpor is this kind of a temporary time at night in which the bird lowers its body temperature. It's kind of like a mini hibernation. Lowers its body temperature, lowers its heart rate, lowers its respirations, lowers its digestion. Everything is, again, it's like a hibernation, and it then saves energy overnight. Of course, the consequences of that is that they lose consciousness and they're very vulnerable at that point. So birds who go into torpor typically do that when they are in a cavity or some kind of protected area. There are some birds who sit out on open branches that go into torpor, and those birds are called owl food. That's what happens, yeah.
Special fat layer, would it be brown fat? Is it similar to brown fat?
It is a brown fat, yeah. And that's a whole different talk. We can go, because birds have two different types of fat, the white fat and brown fat, and they're used for different things. Some of them, and we could probably get into it because they use special fat for migration too, for their flights. So there's a lot going on here. And then there's the true nomadic birds, like our goldfinches here. They wander around the country with no pattern of seasonal movement, and they just kind of show up to wherever the food is at. You know, it sounds a lot like me. I just kind of show up wherever the food's at, and show up at here, you know. So. Fueling for trips here. At this time of year, the birds are moving to a hyperphagia stage, 25 to 30% fruit intake increase. So the birds are really eating a lot more to put on some extra fat. Now this is a delicate balance, okay? because if you're a bird and you overeat, what happens? You can't fly. It doesn't work. So you got to get that sweet spot in there too. So we got ducks, Tekiela geese. We got so many warblers, thrushes, sparrows switch from an insect diet to a fruit diet before they migrate, and this helps them to put on some extra fat. So here we go, the two types of fat. Brown fat, 8 to 10 times more energy than the white fat, usually supplied during migration, not usually supplied during migration. So the brown fat is the one that really gets them going for our migratory birds. So non-migrators, 3 to 10% fat in their total body mass. Long distance migrators have upwards of 50% fat. And that's about the threshold in which after that they have trouble flying. So short distance migrators only put on about 25% fat. So these things are going on right now. There's a lot of feeding, putting on the extra fat, putting on extra feathers, going through all these different processes in order to get the bird to migrate to go. And then you got things like the hummingbirds here. They carry enough fat to make it over the Gulf of Mexico, which is a distance of about 500 to 600 miles. So our eastern, a ruby-throated hummingbird will kind of head down south, up by me, they're already gone, and they end up at the Gulf of Mexico, where they kind of fuel up, they stay for a couple of weeks, Alabama, Texas, and they kind of sit and wait for right weather conditions. And when the weather conditions are correct, they've got enough body fat on them, they will take off and they'll fly 500 to 600 miles across. And which is pretty amazing when you're thinking about a bird that weighs less than 1 U.S. penny. These are just ridiculously tiny little birds. And it was often thought that it was impossible for them to do this. And that's how that whole, notion of, hummingbirds riding on the backs of geese, oh Lord, and they do this amazing flight across, and it takes them about 24 to 26 hours to do this. And if you don't think that this is totally amazing, I challenge you, get in your car and drive for 24 hours, 26 hours straight, and then get back to me, because it is really a heck of, and you think about it, they just can't stop and rest. They stop, they hit the water, and they're in big trouble. So, why do birds migrate? There's lots of different cues. A lot of people, I think, mistakenly think, well, there's a shortage of food, so that they migrate. Well, actually, probably not. The main thing that cues a bird to migrate is the photo period. The photo period is the time from sunrise to sunset. All right? If you thought about it, if they were cueing off on weather, the weather's different every year. So it would be a very unpredictable cue for you to leave. So you got to find something that is very predictable, that doesn't change. And what doesn't change is the amount of daylight. And that's called the photo period. And the photo period will then trigger, here's another thing, okay, I don't want to get off track too far, but as mammals, we perceive daylight through our eyeballs. That seems pretty, that's a no-brainer, it's pretty easy, right? We perceive the amount of daylight through our eyes. Birds perceive the amount of daylight directly through their skull into the hippocampus of their brain, and that's how they perceive the daylight. So once again, just in the mechanisms of how they perceive daylight is completely different from mammals. So very, very different type of systems going on here. And so with that, it kicks off the endocrine system to secrete hormones in the bird's body, and they get what's called migratory restlessness. They start like moving the direction that they need to go. And they start preparing, they start eating more and so. So it's not like they get a choice. So the next time I hear somebody say that they have to take down their hummingbird feeders to, you know, force their hummingbirds to migrate, I want to strangle them, you know. The analogy I always have with them is that, you know, if that's all it took was for you to leave up your hummingbird feeder and it stopped them to migrate, I mean, these birds wouldn't live very long, would they, right? And they will migrate whether you want them to or not, all right? And the birds, by the way, and the birds that don't migrate, there's something wrong with them. They have a flaw in their internal mechanisms that cause them to go. And yet, what do we do as people? You know, we get out heat lamps for them, we feed them, we get you know, special teams who go out there to track these birds, and then we put them on airplanes and we fly them down south. It's like, people, if you thought about it, you're just taking bad genes and putting them back into the market, you know? This is a bad idea. You don't want to do that. A bird that doesn't migrate should, in fact, perish. Go ahead.
I was just going to quickly ask, is there a relationship between migration and the stars?
We're going to get to that. Yeah, we're going to get to that. So the other thing is that as far as forcing birds to migrate, the other analogy I always say is that it's like your child. You didn't force your child to get up and walk. Your child got up and walked because that's what it does. And the same thing, that these birds are going to migrate whether you want them to or not. You know, that's just how it is. And other factors that kind of help contribute to it, because I'm sorry folks, it's not a black and white yes and no thing. It's a variety of things that cause these things to happen. One is the daylight, two is the availability of food, and three is the changing of the weather. Not so much as the changing of the weather, but weather that aids in pushing them along. So you don't see in the fall a lot of migration going on when the winds are howling out of the south. But you do see a lot of migration when the winds are howling out of the north, because it helps push them along and they take advantage of those types of things. So and then we have these internal clues here, genetic aspects of it. For example, peregrine falcons that nest in the north are migrators, but those that are in the south don't migrate. We learned this the hard way. So peregrine falcons were nearly wiped out, and we had to reintroduce them. So what did they do? They went and they collected up eggs from different parts of the country to get the genetic diversity, right? Bred those birds together, raised them up, bred those birds together to have birds to release to the wild, to repopulate peregrine falcons. What ended up happening though is that the birds that were collected from up north migrated, and the birds that were collected from down south didn't. When you bred them together, some of the offspring migrated, some of the offspring didn't. And it was like, oh, interesting. You know? How many times you gotta be hitting the head, you know, to realize these things. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. This is not a clear-cut thing. There's so many different things that go along with it. Here we talk about the hormone production and all these birds too. There's lots of other things to think about too when we get into the depths of migration here. So complete migrators that leave long before the weather changes. This is a good example of it. Orchard oriole or Baltimore orioles. Do you think weather has anything to do with it? I don't know about you, but they leave my house at the end of August when it's still hot, you know, and they're leaving. So weather had nothing to do with those birds at all, or the change of food sources. They just migrate. They really do. Snow geese are another good example of that too. So here we want to talk a little bit about the photo period, the amount of daylight from sunrise to sunset, and it's very different. We see it here, the longer summer days, the sun goes up higher, and the shorter days in the wintertime, like that. We talked about the inconsistent and all that type of thing. So some of our birds then migrate during the daytime, some of them migrate at night. Uh-oh, here we go again. It's not just one way of doing things, it's very different. And a lot of people are always amazed at the fact that these birds migrate at night, which shouldn't be, because when you think about it, it's really probably the best time to migrate. Our daytime migrators, like sandhill cranes, take advantage of our thermals, our warming columns of warm air to help push them along, and they need to be able to, go long distances. Other birds, our smaller birds, typically go at night. And the reasons why they migrate at night is they need to feed during the day. They cannot carry enough fat to get them through several days. So therefore, they have to migrate at night, next day they feed. So they'll use up almost their entire fat supply all night long of flying. You know, if you're gonna fly 250 miles, at the end of that time, you've used up all your fat supply, you need to refuel, if you will. They rest during the day. There's more favorable atmospheric conditions at night. The winds are more laminar, flatter. It's easier for them to fly. And then there's cooler temperatures at night. Think about it, if you're doing this all night long, I mean, how long before you start overheating? You know, it's a lot of work for these things. And so cooler temperatures helps them to not overheat, and also helps them to not lose all their water and become dehydrated. There's less predators hunting at night too, and navigation with the stars is perhaps easier than using the landform geography below. So, all right. So let's see if we've got something we can summarize here, because we're already running long on the talk here. So research into migration really started in the 50s and 60s. So lots of different things had happened here. I'd like to talk maybe about this here with the white-crowned sparrows. Trapped in South Carolina. Some flown 1,800 miles to Boca Raton in Louisiana. Others 2,400 miles away to Maryland, and released the next year. 30 of these banded birds were trapped again in the same area of California. This is showing that the adult birds are migrating different from the juvenile birds. Question?
We had a female hummingbird this year at our Hummingbird Festival, and it was banded, because we do banding at the event. It was its 4th visit to us.
Yep. So they do find habits too. So there's a lot of different things. I'm not going to go into all this. Here's a classic example of it. When the whooping cranes, you guys know about the whooping cranes, critically endangered species, they were down to like 15, 20 birds, kind of brought the population back up, and they were reintroducing to south central Wisconsin. But they needed to show these birds how to migrate, where to migrate to. So what they did was they took costumed people who were dressed up like cranes. Has anybody ever gone and done this? They don't do this anymore. They stopped the program. So for about 12 years they did this. Costumed peoples with a little crane hand on their, and they fed the birds. They raised up these birds, and then they would fly in ultralights, and the birds, these are baby whooping cranes, they would follow behind them. And then what they did was they would go out of south central Wisconsin, and they flew down to Florida. And they would show them the route. And it would crack me up, because they would always leave about this time of year, and it would end up taking them 120, 140 days for the ultralights to fly from south central Wisconsin down to northern Florida, where they would spend their winters. You know, 140 days. It's like, you could have walked there fast. And that was kind of maybe the linchpin with this here, you know, that's kind of why it didn't work. And I love this, because then they would have the birds banded, and they knew who, you know, they had transmitters on and everything. And then in the springtime, the birds did not need to be shown how to get back. They would come back on their own. Does anybody want to take a guess how long it took for them to get back?
140 days.
4 days. This just cracks me up. Well, you know for sure they didn't stop and ask for directions. These guys never did. So, anyway, so this was an interesting thing. Now we're talking about, there's a western population of whooping cranes. These are the wild birds. There's about 275 of them. They're up in Wood Buffalo, Canada, and they come down and they migrate down to Texas, where they spend their winters down in Texas. Anybody been down to the Texas where the whooping cranes are at? It's pretty cool, isn't it? Yeah. So there's some interesting things going on here. Here in Minnesota, we kind of learned the hard way. We introduced trumpeter swans because by 1900, trumpeter swans were wiped out. They were all gone. And so went to Alaska, got a bunch, bred them in captivity, took those birds and had young from them and released those into the wild. Didn't do this to them. And so therefore, normally they would have migrated out of Minnesota down to places like Missouri for the winter time, and then would have came back up. Well, they didn't show them how to migrate. Now we have about 2,500 trumpeter swans in the wild in Minnesota, who all gather in one place in the wintertime, because it's the one open spot on the Mississippi River where a big nuclear power plant kicks out warm water and keeps the river open. And so the swans are all sitting around going, damn. We do good sometimes and we do bad sometimes, right? So, some of the experiments that they've done with these birds, excuse me, they've proven that these birds can feel the magnetic pull of the Earth, the poles of the Earth. So they put them in these different apparatuses, and they can change the magnetic orientation, and it gets these birds to reorient themselves and different things, proving the fact that these birds can feel the poles of the Earth. I would love to have that. I would love to have that kind of built in. I can feel which way is north, which way is south. That would be pretty darn neat. So lots of different things going on there. Birds like the pigeon, the rock pigeon here, have microfibers in the tip of its bill or the tip of its forebrain that are magnetically charged and allow the bird to feel which way north is at. Again, that would be so cool to have. So they use, yeah. They have GPS. I'm sorry?
I thought most guys had.
Most guys do have that.
Compass doesn't work.
So some birds have a magnetic compass, others use visual cues. So you've heard about the migratory flyways. The birds get to know these flyways. They're usually down major riverways such as the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, and those flyways help guide them along on their journeys. And then a lot of birds learn their migration, kind of getting back to that. And we didn't go through that starling study, but the starling studies show that adults can go back, take any way they want. They can take different routes back to where they're supposed to be, where the juveniles kind of have to learn. In that one study, it showed that the starlings will, the young birds, the hatchling birds, the ones that were hatching in springtime, will do like a predetermined distance on their migration in a predetermined way. But at age 1, they change and they're able to navigate and do their own thing. So that kind of shows that these birds sometimes have a kind of a built-in temporary genetic code that tells them to go this way, but then as age 1 or age 2, they're able to learn and then do their own thing and figure out. So there's lots of stuff going on in here. Again, this migration is not something really simple. This is really, really complex stuff. So, and all this might be the tip of the magnetic iceberg, so to speak, because there's so much going on with these birds, and we really don't know. So, and pigeons are a good example of this too. And by the way, a compass does you absolutely no good if you don't know the time of year and the time of day it is too. So it's believed that all these birds have some kind of internal clock that helps them on their way too. And they can't always depend on the position of the sun, since the sun doesn't shine every day, and so there's so many other things going on. They did a nice study with indigo buntings. They put them in a little kind of a cone-shaped device with, everybody's old enough here to remember what carbon paper is, right? If I talk to kids, they all look at you like, huh? You know? Anyhow, they put carbon paper in there, and it would allow them to see which way the bird was orienting. They put it inside of a kind of a planetarium, and they shine the stars in the way that it normally would. And then in the fall, when the bird is experiencing its migratory restlessness, it lines itself up with the stars and tries to go that way. It hops on the edge of that cone, slides down, and keeps going, and so they get a real clear view of which way that bird is going. The next night, they take the planetarium, they project it in a different way, and what does the bird do? Turns. And goes, proving without a doubt, they're lining up with the stars somehow, some way. Quick question, how many of you could do that? Yeah, no kidding. This is just a bird looking up, going, all right, this is the way I need to go. Holy mackerel, right? So each spring and fall, millions of birds use these flyways, and here they are. We have the Pacific, the Central, the Mississippi, and the Atlantic flyways. These are really well-defined areas. And this is where you get into that whole thing when we're starting to put up wind turbines everywhere. When they are put up in the middle of these very big migratory pathways, sure, it's fine for some times of the year, but during migration, it's a real problem for other birds too. So we have wind. We have to think about this. Now we have to think about the wind. We have to think about the drift. Any pilots in here, you know what I'm talking about. You have to figure out, headwinds, tailwinds, side winds. So you got a red-tailed hawk that's flying along. It needs to go this way, but in order to orient itself, it has to orient itself with the wind, this direction, on the angle, like this. And so the bird has to fly on an angle in order to go that way. See what I mean? So there's a lot going on in here. So Sometimes birds fly in flocks because there's safety in numbers, and then sometimes they fly themselves, like hummingbirds and warblers. So there's no one specific way in which everybody migrates. They're all slightly different, right? So typically smaller birds fly at lower elevations, larger birds at higher elevations. That should make a little bit of sense. And some birds need to cross tall mountain ranges. Sometimes we don't think about that. They're flying upwards of 18 to 22,000 feet. So most of our small songbirds migrate at night and fly below 2,000 feet elevation. That is very low, and you can see these things on Doppler radar. So there's all sorts of websites that have the Doppler radars for different areas. You can see these birds migrating. An estimated 90% of all of our nighttime migrators fly below 6,000 feet. So, and our high-flying birds are usually daytime flying birds too. So spring migration is like a race. They got to get back to the breeding grounds. Remember, it's all about reproducing. You got to get back to get to that best territory. So the springtime migration is like a sprint. It's like quick, we got to get back. The fall migration is like, yeah, I'll get there. You know, it's been a tough summer. I'm on my way. You know, fall migration is much more lackadaisical. There's no big push for them, other than their normal internal things. So. We got different flight speeds for these birds. House wrens, these smaller birds, are 10, 12 miles per hour. Can you imagine having to go several thousand miles at 10 miles per hour? You know, I have a hard time keeping it under 80. So, white-throated sparrows are, the smaller the bird, the slower you go. Bald eagles upwards, 125 miles a day that they can fly. So, or speeds can get really, really high on these things too. So. Now, when we talk about formations too, this is a very interesting thing to look at. When we're talking about the V formation, we all know about that V formation, right? Did you ever see those Vs like this? Did you ever see it where one side's shorter and one side's longer? Do you know why that is? There's more birds on that one side. Stick around, I got a million of them. So, oftentimes when they're in those V's, we think of them as in a straight line. In fact, they really aren't. They're stacked up in a kind of the low birds out front, and they move up from there. And the reason for that is this vortex, is because we all know that it helps them, right? Helps them. We don't know exactly why, but we all know it helps them in their efficiency when they're flying. But how does it help them? And in fact, it's the vortex of the turbulence coming off the wing. So front bird flaps, off of that flap comes a vortex. If you're riding right behind them, are you in that vortex? No, you're not riding on that vortex. So when it flaps, you get up on top of it, and then that guy flaps, and you get on top of that one. And it works that direction, okay? So it's not a flat line. It's like when you're driving down the highway and you get right behind a truck, the wind is kind of relatively smooth there. You move out to the side, it's like you get that vibration of that vortex, of that wind that's swirling. And that's what they're getting on to help fly. Now, sometimes they do flat drafting like pelicans, where they get in a single straight line and they'll draft behind each other. And this is where we first actually saw proof that this helps them. They put heart monitors on American white pelicans and monitored their heart rates while flying. And the lead bird had a heart rate that was anywhere to 10 to 20% higher than the other birds behind them, showing them that they are getting a benefit by drafting right behind the other one. So the straight line birds tend to be right behind each other, the V's tend to be stacked up. All right? Lots of things here. So we see that a lot with our sandhill cranes, and that's exactly how it works in this direction here. Snow geese, same thing like that in that vortex way. All right. Oh, you know what? Let's look at some migration. No sound, but this is Platte River in the springtime with sandhill cranes. And when there's migration, there's migration, and that's just the wonders. If you've never done the Platte River trip, it's well worth your time. I lead a trip every year there. I have for 30 years. It never gets old. We don't have sound. Here's another one. These are just fun videos. Migration is when you're out and you're watching migration, something like this, I don't know about you, but it really stirs something inside of me. It really kind of touches, kind of a primordial feeling inside that this is really something. It really is. To see this that's going on. You know, tens of thousands of birds, hundreds of thousands of birds, all doing the same thing, all in the name of trying to keep the species going. And it's really, really something. So destinations from start to finish, we got some interesting things going on. Male versus female juncos. Here they are in the summertime, and then when we see them go south in wintertime, the males stay further north, females go further south. Which just proves the guys are not that smart. Yeah, the women are down in the warmth, the guys are up there going, hey, this is great, you know. So, some interesting things here. Tiny transmitters track birds for 950 miles during migration from Arkansas to Illinois, and birds flew 6 nights on an average of 7 hours per night. About 66 miles in one night, 234 miles on another night. It really depends on the wind speed that helps them move them along. So some really interesting things going on in here too. We talk about our daytime birds like our Shepshin hawks and our broadwing hawks. They migrate during the daytime on kettles of warm rising air, average speed 20 miles per hour, and some days they travel about 60 miles, and other days they go upwards of 150 to 200 miles too. So. We talked about the hummingbirds, then we talked about some birds who, like the Planetary Warbler, who comes out of the eastern United States, all heads down towards Florida, and then makes this jump across. And then, in the wintertime, in the springtime, they kind of stage over here in the northern part of South America, and they shoot up across through the West Indies and up into the United States again, crossing a lot of open water, which, again, we thought not that long ago wasn't even possible. Look at this, the black-pole warbler here flies about 2,400 miles with no place to rest. It's going from central Brazil all the way up, or it starts out up here, Nova Scotia area, and comes on down, all across the ocean. How the heck, you ever been on the ocean? How do you know which way is which? You know, you can't see any landforms anywhere. It's just crazy how they're doing it. Daytime flying, nighttime flying. And they just keep flying. It's just really amazing stuff. And then what's different about it is that they come back up a different route. So we see them going different ways, doing different things. Common nighthawks, for example, they follow landforms. So they're going to come down to the tip of Florida, and they're going to go out into Cuba, and then work their way across, trying to cross as little open water as possible, or they'll come down through Central and South America. Same thing with a lot of these birds, like the barn swallow, doesn't cross open water. They won't do it. They can't do it. And then you got other birds like the red knot, which is just crazy in what they do. And, so they're going to start up here in the Arctic, and they're going to end up down in the Antarctic. This is just ridiculous. 9,000 miles one way. Why would you do this? But that's a human thing. We would ask, why would you do this? Nature doesn't ask. It works, so therefore they continue on. So, yeah, and like many other shorebirds, red knot populations are not doing well right now. Of course, that might have something to do with our, the horseshoe population going down, and so on and so forth. So, and then we got crazy migrations like the tundra swans. Tundra swans nest up here in Alaska and all across in the Arctic, and then they come in the fall. They make a migration from up here all the way diagonally. They'll do like a 3 to 4 day non-stop flight, starting up here in Alaska, and go all the way down here to the upper part of the Mississippi River, near Wabasha, Minnesota. And it's just crazy. At my house, I can watch them on nice days when the winds are blowing. I see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of swans flying over, day and night. You hear them at night as they're going over. Then they will sit on the Mississippi River for 3-4 weeks, feeding and feeding and feeding, and then they'll take another 2 to 3 days and do a non-stop flight all the way over to the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. And that's a heck of a migration. In the springtime, they don't go the same way. They go up the eastern seaboard, take a left-hand turn, they cut across, and then go over to it. So it's just crazy what they do. And then you just see thousands and thousands of them when they do it. This is the Mississippi River. This is what it looks like there. And then we've got even more crazy birds here. Bar-tailed godwit, a non-stop flight from Alaska down to New Zealand. It's ridiculous, And from New Zealand, on their way back north, they don't really stop, they just keep going. So they just kind of come down here, brief lay over, go up into here, and just keep going, making their way through the Pacific Rim and back up into Alaska. One big circle, takes them a whole year to do it. Just crazy stuff. And the Arctic tern, some of the longest migrators we have here. Arctic tern flies an astounding 48,700 miles in a round trip. So it's calculated that over a 30-year lifespan, the bird will fly 3 trips to the moon and back. Little tiny bird, this guy. Just, wow. You know, that's all you can do is just look at it and go, holy mackerel. Right? So birds face countless obstacles, dangers, both natural and man-made. And so, of course, the number one killer of all birds are, of course, windows and buildings, and so they run into a lot of those problems. Here's a great migration story with the purple martins. These guys, yeah, they're big dragonfly eaters. They all go down to Brazil, and we don't even know where in Brazil. So, I mean, it's 2019, folks, and we can't even figure out where certain birds are going to. That's just crazy. And but they make these complex migrations. I had purple martins at my house. I have a bunch of gourds up, and I just watch these birds in awe. And then all of a sudden, they're there all, you know, they get there in spring, they're there all summer long, and all of a sudden one day, gone. That's it, and everything's quiet. And it's just not the same when it's all done. So, rerouting for weather. So this is an interesting phenomenon that the birds, it is believed that they can sense the low pressure systems and move out of the way of the storm. Let the storm go through and then move back. I would like that. That would be kind of a cool thing, you know. So there's all sorts of stuff going on there. Is this a video? Let me look. I think it's a picture. All right. There's such thing as reverse migration. So some birds, they come up north. Guess what? They run smack dab into winter, and what do? They turn around and they go back. Well, smart bird, right? It happens a lot. We see that a lot with our loons. We see that a lot with you know, geese and ducks and things like that too. So lots of stuff going on there too. What do we got here? And then the Rufous Hummingbird. This guy is breaking all the rules, you know. I just love it. The Rufous, you know, it's the furthest north nesting hummingbird, and is now showing up in all sorts of different places. And this is the bird that's predicted to move into the eastern half of the United States in the not so distant future. And we could see this bird coming to people's feeders in the east. They're spending their winters along the Gulf Coast and spending the whole entire winter. They're not even going down to the tropics. These are really good birds. So, are you throwing me out?
No,
Oh,
never.
all right. There's some other things that are kind of interesting too. Loon babies migrate by themselves. So the way this works is, by the end of summer, you have the 2 adult loons. Of course, the adult male, he leaves first. Typical guy. He's like, "Yep, see you, honey, bye, gotta go," you know. And then the female, about 2 weeks later, she'll leave. The baby can't even fly yet. So the baby has to teach themselves how to fly, and then once they teach themselves how to fly, they have to migrate. You gotta wonder, how do they know where to go? And how do they know when they got there, they're in the right place, you know? These are all questions that we still don't know, and they're very interesting stuff. Yeah. So migration is basically it's an amazing thing, but also can be difficult, death-defying things that birds do. It's estimated that up to 1 billion birds die annually from hitting windows. 1 billion birds every year. 7 million perish after striking cell phone and radio towers and wind turbines, and millions more are killed by domestic cats. So there's a lot going on here. Birds face habitat loss, impacting stopover areas, feeding areas, nesting areas, fragmentation, isolation. All of it is a big deal. So migration is not just a north-south bird trait. Birds around the planet take part in it. It's just not a North American thing. And so it's really kind of one of those things. And it's one of those subjects. You can hit the lights, and I'd be happy to answer a couple minutes.
For you.
Oh, for me! So questions about migration? Yeah.
Are the lifespan of the migratory birds less than the non-migratory birds? In other words, it's kind of like a vehicle. If I drive it back and forth to Texas, after a while it wears out.
Yeah, good question, but no. Because all of the individual species all drop, or let's say it would be a good example. all broad-winged hawks migrate, okay? And so it doesn't shorten up their lifespan at all. Now, of species like American robins, where some of them don't migrate, say 10% of them don't migrate, and 10% of them hang back, and it's a heck of a winter, you will see a higher mortality rate amongst them. But you will also see that the reproductive success rate of those that didn't migrate is higher too. So they're able to pass on their genes. And that's what it's all about, is being able to reproduce and get out those. So it's, again, it's not one of those quick, easy answers.
Did the hurricane down in Texas 2 years ago, did it play havoc with the hummingbirds? We have not seen as many.
Yes, absolutely. The answer, did you guys hear the question? Did the hurricane play havoc with the birds, with the population? Absolutely, without a doubt. Weather plays havoc with all the birds. Just a personal experience. I have 6 to 8 hummingbirds all the time at my house, and one May we had a typical springtime thunderstorm came through with hail this big, shredded my hostas to ribbons, and after that storm, 1 hummingbird, and I've yet to recover from that. Can you imagine that? You're a bird this big, and you got stones the size of a house basically coming at you, frozen rocks hitting you. You're not going to survive that. So the weather plays a huge part in these birds' survivability. Yeah.
What causes a woodpecker to get into guttering in early summer or spring and sound like he's beating the house down with wood?
Well, that's just, yeah, you guys, that's just a male bird proclaiming his territory. Classic, that's all they're doing.
Woman, hear me roar.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a male announcing a territory, trying to attract a female by finding something that resonates, something that echoes, if you will, hollow log. It could be a mailbox, it could be a gutter, whatever it is, and it makes a loud noise by tapping on it, and that's what, they're not causing any damage. They're doing that simply just to say, hey, look at me. So, go ahead.
We're from Delaware, and the East Coast, Alabama.
Yeah.
So, once in a while, we get, like, a year ago or two, we got a little egret from wherever, Africa,
Yeah,
wherever, England. How does that happen?
So if you didn't hear the question, she wants to know, they had a little egret that showed up in Delaware, and this happens all the time, where we're seeing birds who are way out of their range showing up, and it's very, very common. And we don't know exactly why, but storms is a really good theory of it. Think about what's happening. These birds get caught up in a storm, and they can just take it. It could be, and a lot of times, this is how it is, their navigation system is defective, and they go to different areas. And then what happens is those birds usually don't survive, which again is the way it should be, because you don't want those defective genes in the pool, and you want them out. And so those birds usually perish, and that's probably a good thing. But yet, what do? We jump right in, and we have to save this bird. Oh my God, and we can go these heroic efforts. Yeah. So.
They hang out with all the other egrets. They don't.
Right. No, they're different species. Yeah, different species. You can't.
Do the migration of bats parallel the migration of birds?
So migration of bats is very different, of course. Just a reminder, bats are a mammal. These are birds we're talking about, so there's a lot of big differences. And typically speaking, like the Mexican free-tailed bat, all of these nectar-feeding bats follow the season as the nectar becomes available. They come up into the United States, typically Arizona, New Mexico, Texas area. They come up and they circle around and go back down too. In addition to that, like have you ever been to Texas for Congress Bridge or the Kraken Cave or any of those things like that? Yeah, those are all females. They come up, give birth to their young, and then go back down south again too. Very, very different type of things. You don't see the males migrating, you see only the females. There's big, big differences between them. Yeah.
We've experienced several times either robins or orioles banging into the windows constantly for weeks.
Right. Seeing the reflection, and they're trying to drive off the perceived, well, males and females do it, but yes, they try to drive off what they see as competition, and it's actually just their own reflection, and that's a very common thing. What do you advise usually? Tell your customers, what do you do? When they have lunch? Take the reflection. Piece of cardboard, I had a lady who said, I got this mail cardinal, he's at my window. I said, well, cover up the window. So I said, it'll go away in a couple weeks. So she covered it up and took it away and started doing it so she could cover it up again. And I said, it'll stop, as soon as the hormones stop raging, and, typical guy, as soon as the hormones go away, it'll be fine. Like that. Yeah. 5 months later, she's still calling me. It's young mail.
Not a bright light bulb.
The females do it too, yeah.
I actually had a customer just this last week who told me she had a male cardinal that was doing that, and somebody had told her to put newspaper on. So she put in, when she told me she put newspaper on, I thought she put it on the inside of the window, and I was like, well, you probably is still seeing his reflection. She's like, no, I put it on the outside. I was like, put a motion activated tree there.
There's lots of different things that can help stop the birds from doing that. You just have to come up with, yes, sir.
They're just going to be starting a study on the effects of the negative and positive ions
Yes,
on migration of habitat. They have already done it with pigeons
yes.
and have found that the negative and positive ions, according to one of the professor, Lou Carver, in the University of Alberta, has found significant problems in the atmosphere. What do you think of that?
Well, so it wasn't that long ago, they proved that pigeons, again, because it's an easy bird to work with, pigeons can actually visually see negative and positive ions in the atmosphere.
Correct.
What the hell is that about? Okay, and this should be one more reason for you to go, man, we don't know what the hell we're talking about when it comes to this stuff. And we cannot, as people, we fall into this trap every single time. We think whatever it is that we see, whatever it is that we hear, whatever it is that we taste, whatever it is, worse yet, whatever it is we feel is what the birds do. And it is completely wrong. If a pigeon can feel the pull of the earth and can see negative and positive ions and can see in UV light, we don't know what's going on. You don't have a clue. You cannot project what you think is going on. It's just simply not true. The birds are, we're finding this even with mammals now. They've discovered that mammals, some shrews can use ultrasonic underground. We don't know what this is like. And so we get into this where we, again, try to put our human notions, our ideas onto them, and we're almost always wrong. You gotta be really careful with this type of stuff. So yes, I think we're just getting into this whole negative and positive ion. It's gonna really take a lot of our theories, which change all the time. Remember how we used to think that snowy owls only migrated because of food shortage? Now we learn, no, it's actually because of food abundance. We have to adapt, we have to change. That's the scientific method, by accepting new practices and new ideas and moving on with those and building on those experiences.
The magnetic north is constantly moving.
And the magnetic north is changing too. Yes. Yeah. I know my astronomers at the Nature Center drive me crazy with that. Because we have a telescope that has to be just right. Yes?
Is your new book available now?
Yes, the migration book is available. If in your green thing, you should have a tag for a free book. Stop by the thing. Oh, you want to hold it up? There it is, migration. And, you can share. I'll probably do that if you want. I'll be back at the booth. You know where the adventure booth is at? That way. And I'll be happy to answer any and all your questions there. I'll be there in about 10 minutes when I can pack up everything. Thanks for coming.